Welcome to the Redbeard Embodiment Podcast. I am your host, Alex Green, and I'm on a mission to bring the power of embodiment to people all around the world. In this podcast, we explore how embodiment practices, trauma healing, and knowledge about the human nervous system can help us find our ground, discover new sources of meaning, and create connection in an ever-changing world. The deepest change is embodied change. All right. Well, I am really pleased to be sitting down virtually today with Ro Shore. And Ro is in Corvallis, Oregon. I'm in Boulder, Colorado. But we've set aside this time to talk about Ro's really interesting story with his own journey through embodiment and a book that he is about to release called The Wisdom of My Body, Healing Brown Trauma in a White Prison Through Meditation and Spiritual Embodiment. And as the title of the book probably conveys, it's a book about Ro's own experience with incarceration and a fascinating story of healing and personal discovery. That's the short version of what's included in that. I've been really honored to get a early manuscript of the book. It hasn't yet been published. I've been very taken and moved and inspired by Ro, your story and your writing, and so that's what I would like to talk about today with you. Just completing my introduction here, Ro is the founder of Northwest Wisdom, which is a nonprofit center for healing and embodied spirituality in Corvallis, Oregon, working with folks in person and online. If I understand correctly, you correct me if I'm wrong, Ro. So that's the story. Ro, thanks for taking this time.
Oh, no, yeah, absolutely. We've had conversations before, and it's just been a delight and a pleasure to talk with you. So, yeah.
Yeah, very cool. I think let's kind of jump into your writing project and your book that's pre-released and the story behind it. What do you think is a good place to start in terms of? I mean, of course, we'll go into the context and the story behind it, but even just sort of locate us in time and space. When did you do this writing, and what's the time period that the book refers to?
Yeah, I mean, all those are great questions and great thoughts. I think things just sort of naturally, organically happen when they're supposed to happen in some ways, and I felt like it was just time. So this is actually in December of 22, so pretty recently. I was just telling my wife, I said, I think it's time. Like, I think it's time I share my story. I don't know why. Like, I don't know if it'll be receptive. I don't know if anything will come out
Right.
from it, but I just feel like it was time. And so I felt it in my body to start writing. And I'm a projects kind of person. And so as soon as I get into a project, I get really excited. And then my body just goes. It's like, all right, let's do this thing. I wrote a lot of music in college, and it was the same kind of thing. I'd get into like writing an album or some music or something, and then my soul and my heart and my body would just kind of go with it. And so I think with this writing project, it felt very like it's time. It feels like it's time. I've been out of prison almost 3 years. So at the time it was 2.5 years, which is about how long I was in for. And so it was kind of a significant, like I felt a significant shift in my body when I reached the point where I'd been out of prison longer than I was in.
I believe it.
Yeah. And so, and that shift happened in my body right around November and December. And so it was just kind of like, oh, I think there's some type of release or some type of, consciousness shift or spiritual shift that I just felt like it's time to start writing. So that's what I did. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I wonder if we could set the scene a little bit about just your life, before imprisonment and all of that. That's not all of who you are, obviously. I adopted, grew up in Oregon. Can you just sort of set the scene a little bit about your background?
Yeah. I mean, you just basically summed it up for me. Just, no, yeah. So I was adopted. I was born in Calcutta, India, and one of the poorest cities in the world, one of the most spiritual cities in the world, one of the most colorful cities in the world, and a city I don't remember. Right. So there's right away, there's sort of an idea of like not knowing where you come from. And I think I would sort of say the height of any good sort of hero's journey or spiritual journey is understanding like I need to go on this to leave where I don't belong anymore and then find out who I am and return in a whole different way.
Right.
And so there's something significant, I think, about the idea of not even knowing where home is in some ways. And so, yeah, I was born in Calcutta, India. And then when I was a baby, I was adopted to a white family in Oregon. And I think growing up, there was always this subtle distinction that I knew I was like different. Like, how can you not? I guess some background for people listening or watching. Oregon is a really white state. So it's known for its...
Isn't statistically like one of the whitest states? I feel like I've read that at one point.
Yeah.
Do you know the stats?
Yeah. One of the things I wrote in my book, at some point, I like cited that I had read an article from, I think, the New Yorker or the New York Times. I apologize, I don't remember, but basically saying that Portland is the whitest city in the United States.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I think the statistic, I think like 2% or less Black population in Oregon. And then as far as like people from India, I think it's like 0.008 or something, like just silly, but also makes sense. So yes, to paint the scene is like when people think of Oregon, they think of hippies and liberals and trees and PNW and maybe the Portland airport carpet and like the PDX carpet and Subarus, right? But like
a lot of Subarus. And remember, I went to high school in Eugene, so
right.
I know the scene. Yep.
Yeah, Oregon Ducks for sure. Yeah. I actually graduated from the University of Oregon too. So anyway, that's kind of like that's what people think of when they think of Oregon, but kind of underneath sort of the shadow is just a really racist past that kind of bleeds into its present, right? And I think part of the reality that we're living in is that now people are starting to talk about it, but growing up it just wasn't something that was talked about. So that's kind of setting the scene of, okay, here's this kid from India who doesn't know his birthplace and his birth parents, and he's moving into a white world that doesn't really recognize his own brownness. And so then he learns to not recognize his own brownness, right? So I'm not really conscious or aware to the extent of what a 6-year-old or 10-year-old even can growing up. You're just kind of like, you're worried about like, you know, whether or not you're wearing the right clothes in school. Is kind of the idea. So that's kind of the background. Is, to be honest, I grew up pretty like fairly normal for a brown kid. Like, my dad was a lawyer and my mom was a counselor, and we did okay. And we grew up out in the country, so we grew up around animals and land. And then I went to college, and I guess I should say this, that I grew up very sort of Christian, in a very Christian tradition of a family, and we grew up Catholic, but then, you know, I laugh and joke, but like part of being brown in a white world is like figuring out whatever way to survive. And for me, it was like becoming pretty funny and entertaining. Like that was kind of the way to do things. And so I think I like just jumped ship from Catholicism pretty early because it was boring and there wasn't a social outlet in the Catholic world for young people. And so I joined like the evangelical ship and became...
It was more fun, more exciting.
It was super fun and super traumatizing. It was a good time. And so and so anyway, I went to University of Oregon and studied religious studies, and there around 20 or 21 years old, I started to realize that like my Christian upbringing was
Mm.
like misaligned from my body. Like there was a disconnect, and I started to question a lot of things. And my religious studies background helped kind of and formulate the right questions. But it
Mm.
was very much like from a place of like, why am I starting to disagree with all the white people around me? and,
Mm.
and that was scary because in a very, I say this in my book, but like I had always described myself as an Oreo, brown on the outside, but white on the inside, So
Mm.
like,
Mm.
though I have brown skin
Culturally, yeah,
culturally,
you've
all
grown
I
up in
know is
white
like
culture.
white
Yeah,
culture, right? So
yeah,
it was
yeah.
scary when my body started to like push against what was happening for me. So that
Mm.
kind of sets a little bit of the scene before prison is like I'm doing all the things right. As Thomas Merton sort of famously says, like you're climbing up a ladder, climbing all the right rungs, right? And you reach the top only to realize the ladder's leaning up against the wrong wall. Uh,
Mm.
and I
Mm.
think that's kind of what was happening was slowly and surely uh, I was like creeping up. I got my master's degree in education. I became a teacher. I joined the Peace Corps. I did like
Mm-hmm.
all the right steps, but the hurt and the
Yeah.
grief and the trauma from being brown, from being adopted, from life, right? And
Right.
I also want to, I guess, reiterate, I'm 35, and so this was at a time when a lot of the dialogue and the conversations around trauma and embodiment it wasn't happening. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even have a smartphone in college.
Mm-hmm.
I had a
Mm-hmm.
BlackBerry. So like I don't
Yeah.
and a flip phone. So the point is that like I wasn't in a time where our society was talking talking about the things that we're more willing to talk about now. So
Yeah. Well, so that was a question I had reading the your book was because in it there's a section where you talk about all that had not worked for you from a Christian perspective in terms of the farce of unconditional love
mhm.
and that is typically being said but not demonstrated.
Mm.
Um, but so I was curious about that when you in college because I knew you were a religious studies major. Were you was your Christian identity part of your college years, or was it transitioning, or how would you describe that?
Yeah. Wow. What a great question. I so like all my friends from high school, we were all really, really close, and we ended up going to the same college together and living together in college. And those friends, primarily, not all of them, but primarily, were Christian, and so
Mm,
there was definitely like a maybe an obligation or like a feeling that like I needed to stick to the tribal mentality that I'd grown up with since sixth
hmm
grade, and so um, I was Christian starting out, and then my religious studies classes, um, they started to sort of promulgate a different feeling within me that didn't align with the things I was experiencing
mm,
at the church events and like whatever else in those communities. And so
sure.
I started out like freshman, sophomore year, and then pretty quickly like realizing, oh, my body is no longer agreeing with it. And simultaneously, I was much more excited about the Buddhism I was learning, or the Taoism and Taoism and um, Hinduism, and just the Eastern traditions. I was very like, why is my body much more excited about these kinds of stories?
Sure.
And I didn't have, as a 21-year-old, I didn't have the wherewithal to like give myself credit or give myself permission to say that that was okay. It was almost like a hidden, like I'm not gonna really tell my friends, but I'm like way more excited about some of these other things.
Eastern things. And I mean, and that's such a powerful thread of your book is,
Mhm.
the Eastern themes of Taoism and Reiki and the, direct experiences that you have in that time period. I was thinking about the Reiki piece, like, you're a Reiki master. It's part of the work you do. And there's one anecdote in the book where that's, at least one of the meditations is the one where you're out in the snow, on the prison yard. And that sort of Reiki energy is sort of part of the entry point into a meditation for you. What was your background with Reiki prior to prison, if it indeed preceded that?
Yeah, no, it did. I mean, I'm always learning and growing. So I think it's really important to frame that, like, whatever title I give myself, like, I don't like own that title, and B, I don't necessarily think that like the title actually exists. So to clarify, like, yeah, it's called Reiki Master, and I'm not quite sure, to be honest, why, because from my understanding, um, Reiki is an energy um, that I don't control, and so it's not like
Right.
I'm controlling it or telling it to go anywhere. I'm just kind of a conduit for it, right? Like, I'm a vessel for it to sort of come, and I've been trained, and there's some techniques and some rituals and some things that I've learned to do that help navigate, but I'm
Right.
just sort of a vessel. And so as far as like what I understand about Reiki is that it is something that has always been and always will be. I think religious studies really help me to see beneath the terms and the words that often we get
Hmm.
stuck in. So
Yeah.
for some people who come from a Christian tradition, they're really stuck on the term Trinity and Holy Spirit. Um, and for
Mm.
other people, it might be Chi, right, or Ki, which
Right.
is like Tai Chi or Taiki, which so Reiki, the last part of Ki, right, is the same as Taiki, or so there's a similarity in just the idea of so Reiki actually means like vital life source, or like supreme, like the ultimate just source, or the ground of all being. And
Yeah. I mean, another analog might be Tao, from Taoism.
exactly, yeah, like way,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Right. Well, so I really liked, I mean, the caveat you're giving right now
yeah,
about, Reiki masters, of sort of a funny term.
funny,
You give that same, a similar caveat in the book, which I really appreciated. Me too. First of all, I'm not a Reiki person, but I have studied energy medicine through a number of other traditions, including the Zen tradition,
yeah.
where we talk about ki and chi. So I have those roots, and I have always chafed at the term Reiki master. That it feels like a very American Western weird way to describe a practitioner of Reiki, to be honest. So anyway, I liked I liked that part of your book.
One of my favorite quotes is from Lao Tzu, and he says the fish trap is meant to catch a fish. Once you
Right.
catch the fish, there's no need for the trap. A snare is meant to catch a rabbit. Once you catch
Mm.
the rabbit, there's no need for the snare. And he goes on,
Yeah.
and then he says, words are meant to catch meaning. Once you've caught the meaning, there's no need for the words. Where
Mm.
is the man who
Mm.
has lost his words? I'd like to have a conversation with him. And
Mm.
and I think that's what we're getting at is we in our society get so caught up in the terms that we don't
Right.
see the energy and the subtle spirituality and the patterns underneath those terms. And
Yeah.
and once we get there, we sort of see the patterns are very similar. I think it was the Dalai Lama who at one point said, you find a tree and you go deep enough. So you stick to that tree, you go deep enough, and you start to see that the roots of those trees touch all other roots of all other trees. And
Mm.
he's talking about finding a religious tradition that speaks to you or caters to your needs, and just to your personality and who you are. And I think that there's a lot of beauty in that, in just the idea that, like, trusting that I use the term now universe.
Mm.
I no longer use the term God, which is,
Hmm.
and so I would say, like, learning that the universe is in all things, and trusting that whatever energy is in this thing over here is the same energy that's in this thing over here, and it's learning to see and connect the spiritual patterns in those things without trying to name it as much.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna quote you from your book because I'm not going to quote the page, but you say you can call it God or divine presence, you can call it spirit or Mother Earth. Sometimes I call it the universe. Sometimes I call it the source. I call it multiple things just so that I don't get too attached to any one name. The universal life force is an energy flowing within me, and this energy is calling me to discover a stillness underneath. And I loved that paragraph, as I did so many paragraphs throughout the entire work, because it lets me know so much about who you are and the journey that you were on, which was of self discovery. And I love that for you. Uh, the idea that it became something transcendent of words
Mhm.
makes it feel much more visceral and tangible to my reading. It's like, okay, for that flexibility in a way lets me know that there's there's something real that you were experiencing. So I just wanted to share that reflection.
Thank you. That's really sweet of you. Yeah, I think before before my incarceration, I was so attached to what I wanted it to be and not what was, right? So I was just so
Mm,
attached to ideas, um, and um, and thinking that who I was and my self worth depended upon what I could achieve and what I could accomplish. And I'll tell you what, one thing prison does is it reminds you that that we're all just human beings and we're all just trying to figure it out, and we all get it wrong. And like, if you were to grind it down to, I think, one thing, we're all like scared shitless, man. Like, it doesn't matter if you're at the top or at the bottom, or like, we're all just scared.
mm,
And so I think, like, so Carl Jung, he frames it in terms of like first half of life and second half of life. And so I kind of use that language. And the first half of life is sort of the period of time where you're sort of trying to move up, right? You're climbing the
mm,
ladder, you're doing things right, you're going to school, graduating, going to college, getting married, building your white fence, like whatever it is, you're doing it. And then it takes some type of fall or some type of large failure. And I describe it as like you failing at the one thing you thought you were supposed to do. Uh, and when you fail so largely, everything in the first half just goes away, and you fall into this liminal space or this gray area, or death, right? You fall into some type of death, and
absolutely.
only in sitting with that death and realizing that that death actually isn't meant to hurt you but to heal you, do you then start to move into the second half of life. And that second half of life is not determined by what you do or what titles you have or how much you accomplish or how many PhDs you have. It's just the second half of life realizes that, like, there's a love that flows in all people and in all things, and we all come from the same thing, so why not try to create a safe space for other people to experience that themselves. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, really powerfully said. So I wonder if then that's I wonder if you could set the scene for the heart of the book, which was in incarceration. To my hearing of the story, of quite unjust sentencing, everything to do with probably racism or probably definitely racism. So, but that led you to this context. So yeah, how about if you set the scene of your book,
Yeah.
in your own words?
Yeah. And I think, yeah, sort of well said. And thanks for prefacing it. I don't want to give like too much away, right? And also set the scene. So part of
Yeah,
like part of the reality of my situation that we have said is, yes, I'm was born in India and I have no idea who I am, and I grew up in the one of the whitest places ever.
yeah,
But also, what I haven't said is that I'm super small, so I'm 5'1",
mm,
and so that plays a large role in in experiencing prison, right? Because in
sure,
prison, you know, you're surrounded by, in my case, men who they're defined by the tangibility of their physicality, right? So they're defined by how much they can puff out their chests, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so being 5'1", and being brown and being Indian and um, being in a white prison
Mm.
really kind of sets the tone for um, kind of the isolation and marginalization. So the idea is like I'm marginalized in more ways than one, and and I say this hopefully with as much like compassion and humility as I can, which is I'm also educated, and a lot
Mm.
of men incarcerated are not, and that's
Mm.
obviously an issue, and goes to speak on the systemic racism in our country and all
Mm.
kinds of other things we don't need to get into. But the point being is that being educated was actually a negative thing in prison. So it's
Mm.
another thing that made me stand out. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I just kind of had all kinds of things against me. And
And
so,
it was a very I mean, because it was also I mean, there was probably not all white supremacists, but just heavily white supremacist environment in the prison you were in. Is that correct?
yeah, absolutely. White supremacists and neo Nazis and, swastikas galore, just,
Yeah.
and going to that environment, you know, I grew up not in a lot of wealth, but like I would say middle class, and so
Hmm.
I hadn't been exposed to that type of racism. Like I've been exposed to racism my whole life, but that type of blatant racism I think was pretty eye opening. One of the first nights in prison, the guy next to me was making a shiv out of his toothbrush, and I didn't know if that was for me or not. And
Mm.
what do you do? Like you're being thrown into what feels like a third world country, and
Mm.
I compared it to like the Stranger Things upside down. It was like everything I knew was just like flipped on its head.
Hmm.
So I
Yeah.
think being exposed to that is so traumatizing and jarring. I don't ever want to compare my trauma to anyone else's, so I want to be careful about saying this. But I imagine it's probably somewhat similar to people who experience war for the first time, and just
Mm.
like going into a zone where your body just like tightens up and you're in complete survival mode. Very
Right.
quickly, and that sets the scene as like I am just, and the book starts that I'm already incarcerated, and part of like my ability to survive is I feel like I'm naturally intuitive, and I'm very self-aware of my surroundings, and so I just kind of knew where not to go. Like I just knew this place feels unsafe, this feels like something I shouldn't be a part of. So for example, if I was out on the yard, um, and a fight was about to break loose, I just knew it. Like I could feel it in my body. The energy was getting hot or heavy, and I said
Hmm.
I need to remove myself from this situation, and that happened so many times. And that intuitiveness is, I think, what kept me safe because uh, I ended up spending a lot of time on my bunk
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
prison because you have nowhere to go. And so I think
Right.
setting the scene, part of also what I want to say about prison is it's a place of zero control. You have zero control. You don't get to say when you eat, or when you sleep, or where you go, or what you wear. You don't get to decide who is your neighbor and who is your bunkie and who likes you. You don't get to decide if the CO is going to even let you go outside. The CO might be having a bad day, and so that means you don't get to call your family at home.
Hmm.
And so the reality of my situation parallels um, the the falling into that liminal space I mentioned earlier, which is I think the commonality or the common thread in all people dealing with fear is a lack of control, right? When you don't have control over something, you go into how can I have control over this thing? Um, and prison teaches you really quickly you have zero control, so you kind of need to let that go. And so part of me being on my bunk where the book starts out is I just said I have zero control over anything, but what I do have control over is my own spirituality and my own journey inward. Um,
Mm.
and so I decided I'm gonna I'm gonna use this time, this 2.5, 3 years I was in prison, to just meditate, and to learn all I can about my body, to learn all I can about spirituality and diving inward. So that
Mm-hmm.
kind of gives you the idea that I start out on the bunk of my bed, and it's really loud. So prison is really loud. Bunks are 2 feet apart. It's like middle school for adults. It's like Disneyland
Mm-hmm.
for adults. In fact, some people call it Prisneyland, right? So it's just like this weird environment where you can't ever escape anyone. And so
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
reason why I preface it with that, and the reason why I say that is kind of the only way for me to really like remove myself from the heat of things was A, to stay on my bunk, and B, to use my headphones. So I
Right.
bought some really shitty, cheap prison headphones that look like they're, you know, from the early 90s. And they kind of, anyway, and my book sort of talks a lot about the headphones. But I would
Mm-hmm.
just
Mm-hmm.
turn on the headphones, and I learned to turn on white noise. So at first,
Mm-hmm.
so these are headphones, again, that you just have access to the radio. There's nothing, they're very primitive,
Mm-hmm.
and you know your music that you can listen to really depends upon the frequency and and what you're able to pick up around whatever prison you're in. And so since I was down south in Podunk, Oregon,
Mm-hmm.
country music primarily, and so I
Mm-hmm.
just learned to switch it. I just pretty quickly learned that my body like needed the white noise, and so I just turned it to white noise. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I was going to ask about that. Was that just a pretty much just in that you just that wasn't in it a meditative technique that you had learned? That was just something you came to yourself? Because that concept of of going into the white noise is a theme throughout the book, because that was a main vehicle for your approach to meditation. And so yeah, that was on my mind to ask, was that just organic for you?
I think it's a bit of both. Like I knew from my religious studies background, and spiritual background, that there's something about moving in a rhythm, right? So rhythm always gets you underneath the noise and the mind.
Mm,
So in Buddhism they call it monkey mind, right? Like your thoughts are
mm,
always like monkeys jumping from branch to branch to branch. So
right.
how do we settle the mind? How do we calm the mind and settle it in a way that allows us to drop down? Um, and I used in Eugene, for myself, I used the metaphor of like, imagine you sitting on the bank of the Willamette River or sitting on the bank of a stream, and
Mm,
looking at the stream, and it's beautiful and it's serene and tranquil. And then all of a sudden a piece of garbage or like a pizza box or something like starts to float by. Like you can choose to like follow the pizza box. You can be like, oh God, what asshole decided to like chuck their pizza box? Like, and you follow that and you're no longer focusing on the stream, right? Well,
sure.
it's the same as our thought. Like it's a stream of consciousness, and thoughts are like pizza boxes that actually get in the way of you just focusing on the river or the stream. And so the idea is that in the meditation that I was practicing was, you see a thought, you can follow it all the way down, or you can just notice it, like acknowledge that it's there, and then let it go by.
Let it go.
You just got
Let
to
it
let
go.
it go. And so,
Ca- yeah.
oh yeah,
Well, can I interrupt with another? Am I allowed to read book quotes? Because there's
absolutely, yeah, yeah,
because I another one I pulled out. I really liked you made a comment about rhythm, and really resonated to me from my own. It was really an insightful way to put it, and also
yeah,
resonates with my own meditation background. So I'm going to read this paragraph.
yeah,
Meditation is all about finding a rhythm, and it always starts with a physical one. It's why prayer beads can be found in every religion. Men and women have used prayer beads for thousands of years. Rubbing your thumbs against the beads creates a rhythm too. When you repeat a mantra with your voice, paired with a physical action of sliding the beads through your thumbs, it gets you into a deeper rhythm of the earth. Sometimes I do the same with the volume dial on my radio. It has the same effect. The deeper rhythms are always there for us, but it's often we who don't really know how to enter into it. Participating in the deeper rhythm creates a different kind of frequency in you. It's the same reason why drum circles can be so powerful. Like Wu Wei, you are entering into a larger river. I really loved that paragraph. It really, so in my tradition, Zen, breath is that rhythm, is one of the rhythms. Walking meditation, walking is that rhythm. In chanting is that rhythm. There in the priests, we have the equivalent of prayer beads. That's that rhythm. And that idea of, what are the larger rhythms, the deeper rhythms, to me was a really powerful theme that this paragraph captures, but it was something that I noticed through many of the meditations that you describe, that stood out to me. So I just wanted to
Oh, thank
throw
you.
that in. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the rhythm, I think to kind of circle back to what you're talking about, and the original question is that, like, the white noise was my way of entering into that deeper rhythm, right?
Mm.
So one of the things I practiced before prison, and I guess I should say this, I don't know if I prefaced this, but as much as I was like unaware of who I was before prison, I was still very much practicing meditation and very much deep diving into my own spirituality at a young age.
Mm.
Doesn't mean that I don't have traumas, and it doesn't mean that I don't make really poor decisions, right? But I was still exploring spirituality. I think from like 17 or 18 on, I was really into it. And so one of the things I got into pretty young was Wim Hof, who,
Hmm.
I don't need to go into who Wim Hof is, but basically he has a lot of breathing techniques. He's also known as Iceman for anyone who wants to
Right.
look him up. And
Cold breath practices
yeah,
and cold exposure.
yeah,
That's the method.
cold showers. But
Yeah.
so one of the things
Ice
I was
baths. Yeah.
doing, yeah, one of the things I was doing before prison was doing like his techniques of breathing, but it's
Sure.
very loud and it's very obstructive to what's around you. But the idea is that you're oxidizing the brain and bringing in a lot more oxygen. Well, you can't do that in prison, because the last thing you want to do as a small brown person in prison, and also probably out of prison, is bring attention to yourself.
Mm.
And so I learned pretty quickly some of the things I'd normally do for meditation is not going to fly. Um, and so the white noise quickly became my only source of um, sort of an alternate route to drumming or breathing or anything that would be sort of alarming or like drawing attention from these men around me, because you have your headphones on and the white noise is only for you, right? And so
Mm.
the white noise was able to allow me to drop in, and I had heard about stuff like that. It's why people can fall asleep to sound machines, right? Like
Hmm.
but there's all kinds of research, so I wasn't in any way discovering something that millions of people haven't discovered before me, but it was what I had available, right? And so
Sure.
it's part of my spirituality was and the journey was realizing you use what you have. And in prison, I didn't have a lot, but I was still using what I could
Mm.
to drop down and to drop into that deeper rhythm of the universe and the deeper rhythm of the
Mm.
earth, which happened to be just the deeper rhythm of myself. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Well, so I wonder if we could, yeah, I'm with you. We don't want to give away all of the
for sure.
book, but, but a lot of the structure of the book is centered around, some of your, experiences and encounters with yourself,
Yeah.
and perhaps the universe, through different, different meditative times. And first of all, I also just really appreciated that sort of that vignette structure to the book was really nice narratively. It's like there was the background, there was a story, there was sometimes tying back to something previous in your life that was important to understand. So I just wanted to share here that, really, that to me it made for really compelling reading to sort of get these sort of, pretty important healing and meditative moments for you, but then the reflections that surrounding them and contextualizing it within the prison was so fascinating.
Thank you.
Um, but so I wonder if you could touch a little bit on some of these encounters or I don't know if you call it a healing journey or finding out who you were. I don't know the words you would use, but tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for saying that. That's really generous and kind. So for about 6 months, I was listening to the white noise and just trying to release all thought and focus on my breath and drop into a place that was safe in a place that's not safe, right? Like,
Mm.
again, using what you can. And so for about 6 months, it was just kind of, okay, there's the white noise. And then I kind of learned to drop into the body and feel the different parts of my body. Sometimes, like maybe for the first time, right? Like just, oh, what is this? What does my hand feel like? And so over time, that kind of became deeper and deeper and deeper. And there was one moment that starts at the beginning of this book, is that I was able to use the white noise for my radio and my breath and drop in so deeply that I came to a place where I'm face to face with a younger version of myself. And it's not a dream. I'm not asleep. It's not, lucid dreaming. I'm not on any drugs. It's also not like I'm like astro, like,
Projecting.
projecting or anything like that. No, it's
Yeah, yeah,
it's more
yeah.
of just like there's something in my body that allows me to drop in and I see my younger self. Um, and I'm very curious. Like my present self is very curious. And so I approach him. And one of the most interesting that happens, and this happens at the beginning of the book, so I'm not giving anything away, is that he looks at me and he doesn't know who I am. So like
Mm.
he asks, like, who are you? And it's this weird moment because I know I'm staring at my younger self, and it's not a memory, right? Because it's not like this has happened in any way. So it's like, oh, like this younger version of myself doesn't recognize me. There's some kind of disconnect here. So
Well, right, and just to add in, it's also a very specific scene. I mean, this is not just some abstract younger.
yeah,
It's you as a, I believe, 13-year-old in a school cafeteria
yeah,
is where, if my memory is correct about where this initial encounter took
great.
place.
You have a great memory. I hope people have told you that before. Yeah,
Okay.
and yeah, it's middle school, so a very,
Yeah.
for a lot of people, very traumatizing and hard time, right? It's you're man, you couldn't, if you said to me right now, hey, I'll give you $1 million to live middle school again, you know what I would say? I would say deal. No, I'm kidding. I wouldn't take it. There's no way I could take it. And so yeah, there's my specific age. Was 13, and it was right in
Mm.
middle school, and that was very real. The cafeteria seemed to be a place where you were socially having to figure things out, right? And
Mm,
so,
mm,
so
right.
some of the parallels of the book is that, like, there's kind of a unique parallel of like these drop-ins into discovering my middle school self while being surrounded physically in a prison of people who also have, you know the interactions of a middle schooler, right? So prison is full of 30, 40, 50-year-old men who are acting like 12-year-olds, and they
Hmm.
don't know the weight and the physicality of their own body, so they get
Mm,
mad and they swing and you're done, right?
mm.
Without realizing, like, maybe they got mad because like someone took their candy bar, or something to that level of seriousness. um,
Yep, yep.
and so I think there's something unique that's happening that I'm having to now face in my meditation, in my deepest states. Um, a version of myself who probably never got the attention that he needed, but also, like, in similarity, is the same age as the people I feel like I'm surrounded by. So I think there's something to say about that. Yeah.
Totally, very much so. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think those are parts of the book of what's happening in my meditation, is that I'm realizing that there's unhealed trauma, and in
Mm.
and in prison I didn't have those types of terms, right? Like I'm not really having access to somatic therapy and to podcasts or deconstruction, reconstruction article. I mean, you know what I mean? So I
Hmm.
definitely think that there are, like, the universe was doing what needed to be done in a place where I didn't have like the academic or otherwise access. And so my body
Support
was,
and
so my
yeah,
body was just naturally finding the access that it needed and the
right.
resources that it needed. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you don't mind me just reflecting for a moment, because when I first, first I heard this story when I spoke with you, and then I got to read it, which with much more detail, and that example, encountering this 13-year-old in this very real way, in this manner of uh, him not knowing who you are, and then the a point where you said, hey, like, after some building of at least a little bit of rapport or maybe a little connection, then there was this moment when you said, hey, do you want to get out of here, do you want to go somewhere else? And I think you went to the Umpqua River or something like
Yeah.
that. But so for me, reading it as, and I know I told you this when you and I first met, but there's these parallels, and I'm not trying to, by no means am I trying to
Oh yeah, no.
reduce your experience to the internal family systems model of psychotherapy, but there's so many parallels that leap out to me as an IFS practitioner, that are just so energizing, like this. The difference, I would say, is that, I mean, in IFS, we are encountering parts, often younger versions. We are establishing a relationship. We are having conversations. There's a degree of immersiveness that stands out to me in yours. Yours are like a little bit like the outer world, the prison environment, more or less receding because due to the sort of the depth of your kind of your
Yeah.
where you went with your meditation, for which these scenes would play out. I mean, so with this part, I mean, let's not give away the one about meeting. I call him, you met sort of like a holy man or
Yeah.
something like that. I loved that section
Thank you.
because it was so rich with the dialogue that you had with that. I'm going to call it part just because I'm an IFS guy,
Yeah.
but um, was so moving and so cool. But so yeah, so part of what strikes me so much is like actually this is only half a joke. I feel like when your book does come out, I feel like in all seriousness, I'm going to be suggesting it to clients
Mm.
who are embarking upon IFS work. And there's other books. Dick Schwartz's books are great, no bad parts. But I think that honestly, I think that people will learn to a certain extent how real this can be,
Mm.
um, it be, due to the examples that you provided in your own story. So I just wanted to make that parallel because it's
It's a beautiful
it's
one.
so interesting to me. Yeah.
No, it's a beautiful one, and I think probably the part of myself before prison would kind of try to find some way to distinguish my own uniqueness, like from all the stuff you're doing. But like to me, it's much more richer to find that connection, right? And it speaks more maybe to the authenticity, but to the truth and power of what you're doing, right? Because a part of what I do in Northwest Wisdom and what I do now is help people see the underlying patterns within themselves at a spiritual
Mm.
level. And the reality is a lot of the patterns are the same. Again, it's whether you call it IFS or whatever, like a lot of those things are the same. So you're not taking away from my story. You're only proving that it is probably similar to everyone's story.
There's some universality
Yeah.
to the human psyche. I mean, it's sort of, you mentioned, Jung earlier, and
Yeah.
so much of what he did was, kind of do a deep dive into his own psyche and then sort of report his findings. And to me, that's how I read your book,
Mhm.
is somebody doing um, their own cartography of their deeper psychic landscape, and the way that when we dig deep, we're not actually in isolation. There's a sense of continuity and connection with something much bigger. Uh, I read yours as a similar, charting of the landscape directly and then finding the words to sort of describe it.
Yeah, and exactly. And I think the macro, I'm a believer that the macro always is a reflection of the micro. So what's happening at the macro level, at the universal level, is happening within our very cells. And I think there are often similarities and patterns. I mean, let me give you an example. When I was experiencing that type of trauma for the first time, um, Donald Trump was becoming president, right? So, and I don't want to get to a political standpoint, but more just like the fear and the insecurity and the the black and white pushing against each other. I was experiencing on a physical, like spiritual, like personal level in prison, and that's what people were experiencing on a national
Out there.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so, and I think that on a spiritual level, when you start to connect uh, the macro within you, you can start to see the larger patterns of, or sorry, the micro within you. You can start to understand the macro. But for some people, they want to start at the macro because they need to. And then when they see the patterns at the macro, oh, this is very similar to like things happening within my own body. And so, yes, long story short, I completely agree with you. I did want to say that like that sort of that meditation you're pointing to, that you didn't want to give too much away of that holy person. A part of like, I think a part of that fits in with what we're talking about now is the whole point of that is to sort of say, use whatever helps you, right? Like if you want to use God, like let that help you. Don't, like, if you want to use yourself, if you want to use universe, if you want to use IFS system,
Yeah.
like whatever it is that helps you get to where you need to go, like,
Right.
then use it.
No, totally. Well, and that was so much about that conversation. I mean, can I spill the beans slightly on
Yeah,
that anecdote? Okay. I mean, no, it was so cool because it was like, meeting encountering this guy, and then who are you? Are you Jesus? Are you Buddha? Are you some, and that man speaking back was, who do you want me to be? Like that doesn't matter all that much,
yeah,
which sort of confused one level of your conscious mind. But then
right,
part of the big lesson arising from that particular encounter was this idea, part of his sort of back and forth with you in that dialogue was around, well, who's underneath Jesus? Who's underneath the Buddha? Who's,
yeah,
what that we're not talking about the man, the name. What are we talking about?
yeah.
I really thought that was a cool
Mhm.
piece. Maybe since I
Yeah,
already spilled it,
no,
maybe
yeah.
add anything. Yeah.
So just to set the scene is that this is another meditation, right? So I
Mm,
think it's important to sort of say this, that white noise, if you've ever like gone to sleep with white noise, you pretty quickly start to realize it sounds a lot like rain. Okay, so or water, like dripping
mm,
water, and so
mm,
that was like where I first went, was like, oh, this sounds like water. This sounds like rain. I'm going to like use that to help create a visual for my, for lack of a better word, escape from
mm,
the present surrounding. And so water was my drop in. So I'd listen to it, close my eyes, and pretend like it was raining.
mm,
Because I think it's really important at this point to say, in prison, along with all the other shit, one of the things that I think people don't think about is you have no access to nature. You're no
mm,
longer like connected to the earth. Like you don't have, I remember it took a month or two before I saw a tree for the first time. And it was just,
mm,
uh, yeah, it was just a life altering moment. The first time I saw a tree again,
mm,
and
mm,
so to like jump back, I think part of what my body was doing with the white noise was it was creating a natural sound like rain, because I didn't have access to the natural environment that I so
mm,
loved and connected with, that many people do.
mm,
And so to set the scene is I'm meditating again, and I have my headphones on as I do throughout the book. And it's raining, and it's raining so deep. And I look out my window outside my bunk, and there's a bunch of trees. And I just envision myself outside the fence of the prison in the trees in the rain. And so eventually I'm walking through the trees and I come across this holy person. That's kind of setting the scene of this chapter.
I see.
Yeah, so you kind of understand. So the reader or whatever kind of, or the listener of the podcast kind of understands what we're talking about.
Yep.
And so anyway, I'm having this conversation. I come across this holy person. Like, to be clear, I'm still on my bunk with my headphones on, and I'm so deep that I think that I'm somewhere else, and I come across this holy
Transported.
person. I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
transported, and
Yeah.
I have this deep conversation about spirituality with whoever this person is.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and one, maybe this will be a connecting thread, because one of what you in conversation with him, one comment that he made was, one day you will see that even the harshest things are still included, referring to included within, I don't know. Now I'm going to lose my words, but it, I mean, it was, there was part of the, what you, don't let me speak for you, but part of, I think part of the depth of that chapter was recognizing a certain kind of fundamental oneness or saint or something shared between, and that theme comes up in other moments, this, sense of connection, and here you're in an environment where, look at the white supremacists using racial epithets and the psychology of 12 middle schoolers and all of that, and it's a little bit like the challenge from this, again, who I'm calling the holy man or whatever, was someday this all can be included.
yeah.
Can you speak to that at all?
Oh, yeah. So one of my favorite sort of spiritual leaders or spiritual writers, his name is Father Richard Rohr, and he comes from the Catholic tradition. And he wrote a book called Falling Upward and another book called The Universal Christ. But one of the terms he uses all the time is transcend and include. And
Mm-hmm.
what that means is, what he's getting at and what I'm getting at here is that when you start to awaken to a deeper consciousness and a deeper understanding of who you are, you include all the other parts too, right? And what that does is that gets past the sort of binary nature of our society and the way we respond, right? So we are now in a society that celebrates the binary system, right? You're either Republican or you're Democrat. You're either, for LGBTQ rights or you're not. Like whatever it is. I mean, the list goes on, and we could spend a decade just
Mm-hmm.
things, but you get the idea. But I think that the deeper spirituality in transcend includes as somehow in transcending and finding a deeper love that accepts all things, it also accepts the parts that don't accept all things. And that's a really hard truth, and it's an isolating truth, and it's a painful truth, because what that taught me on a really deep and actually very like just primitive level of being in prison was, okay, if I'm going to discover who I am and transcend what these men are saying about me, I'm going to have
Mm-hmm.
to include them too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a hard journey, right? Because what that means is you have to take your enemies and the people who are hurting you and persecuting you, and you have to start to see them as people too. um, and not only see them as people, but like go as far as what can I do to see them as your very self. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, and kind of what I had to do was um, begin to see these white supremacists. And I guess really quickly, I think one thing that is probably assumed or implied but hasn't been stated was there was a lot of like harm from these men. So it wasn't just like, yeah, they're white supremacists, so like they're scary. I mean, there was a lot of threats, and there's a lot of coming by my bunk and threatening to kill me at night and pushing me, and they have what's called lock in a sock, which is exactly what it sounds like. And that's how people get beat is you take
Mm.
your lock for your locker and you put it in a sock, and when no one's watching, you come. And so I, on a couple occasions, had to navigate around that happening. So,
Mm. Mm.
and I'm very grateful, and I was, I got out of there. But the
Yeah.
point being is that I want to make it clear that like this, I was in an
These
environment.
weren't just these weren't just mean people with yeah, I'm
Yeah,
with
it
you.
was very
Yeah.
unsafe.
Yeah.
It was very unsafe on so many levels, but the spiritual meditations were leading me to a point that said, "Hey, you have to love them too," and
Mm.
that's kind of what you're asking, and what I'm getting at in that is somehow the harshest parts are going to be included. And now being out of prison, that also means on a much more macro level, the hard parts of my life, including prison, are now included and everything else.
Are now included.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean the last part of your prison stint, from my reading, was the phase where you studied and became a paralegal, and then you worked on behalf of a lot of these people who had who were also your tormentors. You were in service to them. Um, did you predict that at the beginning of your prison time, that you would sort of work in that way, or does that fit in with the spiritual unfolding? How do you contextualize that?
Yeah. Again, very good question. No, I had no idea. I had no idea that I was going to become a paralegal. My dad's a lawyer.
Mm,
And so I think that there's just something spiritually ironic, or yeah, just spiritually ironic, maybe just like, kind of the universe like pulling a prank in some ways. Cause I
right.
like grew up being like, I'm never going to be like my dad. Right. So, uh, like, I just feel like there's some humor in that. But no, I have
Hmm.
my master's in education. And so when I was in prison, I was like, well, I'll help people get their GEDs. It sounds like a natural thing to do, but because of my skin color and my situation and whatever else you want to add in there, people wouldn't
Hmm.
want my help, and
Hmm.
it was strange because, like, from an academic standpoint, I was more qualified than even the prison educator, right? Like, I was the most
Hmm.
qualified to help people succeed, but because of their biases and because of their prejudices, they didn't want any of my help. So I
Hmm.
ended up just like not doing that, and
Hmm.
there was nothing for me to do, and
Hmm.
I'm not going to say any of the terms just for, I don't want to
Hmm.
like make people feel unsafe. So in
Yeah.
calling me the N word or in calling me all that stuff, it was like, I'm never going to get help from an N word. Right. I'm never gonna,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, okay, like there's not, I'm not in control. There's nothing I can do. But there was
Hmm.
a sadness and a grief and anger of like let it go. I'm trying to help you get to like a better place in for yourself.
Hmm.
And so the paralegal thing happened just kind of on a whim. So basically, the lieutenant of the prison, maybe like 6 months to a year in, called me up really late one night, and I thought I was in trouble because no one ever gets called up at night. And basically, he was just saying, "Hey, there's a paralegal. They call it law librarian, which sounds like a librarian, but that's not what I was. It's
Hmm.
basically like each prison has what's called a jailhouse lawyer, right? So in prison, people are still dealing with their charges. They're dealing with new charges. They're dealing with what's called like family law. So often spouses want to divorce them or take their kids, or so anyway,
Hmm.
there's all kinds of legal trouble that people incarcerated have no access to
Hmm.
help. And so
Hmm.
the whole idea was that I would train to become a paralegal to help advocate for these men and on their behalf. So which I did.
Right.
I spent 18 months becoming a paralegal, a certified paralegal, and advocating for these men. But as you hinted at and pointed to in the beginning of this question,
Hmm.
these were the men who were wanting to hurt me. So
Right.
I was writing motions, drafting petitions, trying to help get these men's kids back who, their
Yep.
spouse are like, well, I'm leaving you, I'm suing you for $1 million, I'm taking the kids. And these men are coming to me saying, like, my bitch is trying to take everything. And these are the men who called me the N word just 10 minutes ago. Right.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so it was
Yeah.
a very yeah, I mean, humbling position to be in, right? Because all of your body and all of your ego wants to say, dude, fuck off. Like
Right.
I'm not going to help you. But then
Right.
like the deeper part comes in and says, like, you're the one person, and this is the one person who you're supposed to help in this moment. And so how
Mm,
can you like kind of overcome your ego and your biases and your hurt, right? Because I think
mm.
one thing that I want to reiterate in your question and to answer is their attitudes didn't change towards me. That was one of the most
Mm,
like dynamic parts of my book and dynamic parts of my situation was I thought I would maybe gain a little bit of status or safety or something in helping these men, but it didn't change. The same
mm.
men would come up asking for all kinds of help. And then as soon as we got down to a place where they were surrounded by everyone else, it was sort of mob mentality and they go back to being who they know they need to be to also survive. So,
Wow. Yep. Wow. Fascinating. There's two other threads that I on my little mental list. One is a somatic piece, sort of, bodily piece, because, in several, there's in the couple things I noticed, in actually it was in that meditation where you encountered the holy man. There was this reference to the burning, what he asked you, what is this burning, I can see this burning anger in you. And so that was one sort of somatic piece. In another section, there's this reference to what you call the tennis ball of energy in your lower back and sacrum, which to me is that's a somatic pattern I'm familiar with. Like I've had my own version of that. I've worked with others with that. So those kind of somatic pieces really caught my attention as a somatic guy myself. I wonder if you could touch on either of those, like how those flowed into your process.
yeah, I guess being a brown person in a white world, you learn to be be very good at certain things, which is adapt. Um, and in adapting, I became whoever it was that I needed to be. I think the sort of term in counseling that a lot of people use is fawn, right? So you have
Right.
fight, flight. Um, what was the third one? Freeze,
Freeze and
right?
fawn.
And,
Yeah.
and the fourth one that people don't know necessarily about is fawn. And so when you're in a situation where you feel unsafe, or you feel like you're trying to figure out how to survive, fawning is becoming whoever you need to be for those people to survive in a different way or to adapt. And so I think as a
Mm-hmm.
brown kid in a white world, I just became fantastic at fawning, at becoming whoever I need to be. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a lot of pros to that. I do really good in interviews for jobs, or used to, I suppose. Like first dates were usually went pretty well.
You've
Not,
got
not
your charm. Your
not
charm is
second
there.
dates, but first dates. Yeah, exactly. You get the charm factor, for sure.
Right.
Um, that's part of having a fawn characteristic, I suppose. But,
Mm.
but the largest con is you have no idea who you are. So so I don't know if you're familiar with the Enneagram or
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but in the Enneagram, like a lot of threes tend to be people who uh, can navigate a room like with ease.
Right.
But then they go home and they have no idea who they are. And so part of what's happening, I think what's happening in prison in real time is all the strategies that I've grown to use don't work anymore. They can't. Like I can't
Mm.
charm my way out of being a brown person surrounded by white supremacists. There's just no way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
can't say the right thing. I can't do the right thing, and I certainly can't physically leave. Um, and so what's happening is my survival techniques are out the window.
Mm-hmm.
So the only thing I can do is sit with my body. I
Mm.
have to sit with the things that I never have needed to sit with. Um,
Mm.
and so for the first time in meditation, it's not just a spiritual thing up here,
Mm-hmm.
it's a spiritual thing everywhere.
Mm.
And in that moment, in those moments, I'm like you alluded to, connecting to my body for the first time. I'm feeling, oh shit, like this fear that I have, like I can feel it in this part of my body. And so part of the meditation process for me was starting to map out where certain feelings were. Oh, when I'm excited, I feel it here. Oh, when I'm like scared shitless, I feel it here. Oh, when this thing has pissed me off, etc. So you're starting to like map where your feelings are. And so I started to realize the spiritual patterns in me are connected to the psychological patterns in me, are connected to the physical patterns in me, and they show up in energy. And so in like chakra, like, so I don't know if you've heard of chakras, but in chakra work you have 7 different main chakras. You have way more than that, but 7 main chakras, and those are, chakra means wheel, right? So you have these wheels that sort of allow energy to flow kind of up and down. And these chakras, if you aren't balanced in certain areas in your life, can actually block. They can block you from opening and being more balanced in these certain ways. So one of the first chakras is called your root chakra or your Muladhara chakra, and it's at the base of your spine. So it's kind of right down in there, right where that tennis ball of energy is. And of course, the root chakra is associated with safety, security, and feeling grounded. So of course, I was feeling that energy stuck there because look at where I am and look at where I've been. Right. And so I hope that answers your question as to, I started to connect the dots that what was happening spiritually and psychologically was manifesting in very physical ways. And I was feeling it physically in my body. And so you can't push that out. Like you can try, you can try and try and try, but it's like continuing to run into a brick wall. Like, it doesn't matter how many times you run into it, you're not moving that brick wall. And the energy that's blocked and thwarted, the trauma that's somewhere in there, it doesn't just leave because you want it to. So then you have to sit with it in new ways, and that's really painful.
Yeah, well, and what strikes me in your descriptions, I mean, sitting with it in new ways, I think is a good way to say it. I mean, it's almost as though, I mean, you're right. You can't avoid the situation. You can't wish or will these energetic or somatic bodily patterns away. But for you, it sounds to me like part of your meditation was by being with sensation and with the patience and with the time, and that there was a moving through, or oftentimes even those patterns themselves became the gateway to some sort of insight or further clarification about this isn't just a physical sensation. What's the emotion behind it? For example, anger. For example, fear. For example, whatever. Yeah.
And anger for me has always been like, and for a lot of people is like kind of the go-to feeling. And so like learning to like drop down is what's underneath the anger. And often what's underneath the anger are like kind of the 3 go-tos are like grief and shame and sadness. And those are all things that we don't really want to talk about. Like even now, like even like in our world today, as much as we progress, there are things we don't like. We haven't really gotten to a place where we can address our shame completely. That's the hardest thing to do. And so,
yeah. I mean, I'll throw in IFS language. Those we call them exiles, or because like anger, we would usually classify as a protector. Protectors are a little more visible. They're a little more known. They're a little more permitted. But oftentimes, as you're alluding to, oftentimes there's something more underlying that are less. Not too many of us want to wear our shame on our sleeve, or our deep hurts and vulnerability. Those are the ones that we're more likely to sort of tuck away. So that's kind of just to put some.
No, that's great
from my framework on that.
I love it. I have so many questions for you that I'll probably ask off the podcast. But no, I mean, and that was it, is that realizing, oh, these parts of me that I thought were like me as a whole were always my protector self, right? And
Mm,
they were protecting me from the younger versions of myself that never felt seen, right, or never
mm,
felt heard.
mm.
And so I think that's really helpful in putting that language, and it makes a lot of sense. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, so that brings me. So there was something so touching when you told me about it, and it was so touching when I read about it again, and also a little bit IFSy. I hate to keep bringing that in,
Oh no, yeah.
but the so moving, which was, and I'm going to paraphrase it briefly, but then you're gonna kind of give a fuller version, I hope, which is that you shared with me that at a certain point, after having accessed some of those younger and more vulnerable parts of you that needed to be seen, needed witnessing, needed healing,
Mm-hmm.
there's this way that you started extending a tremendous amount of care and compassion and love towards those younger parts who very much deserved that.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the part that really moved me. There was this where you shared with me that by extension, you created a reflection where your future self post prison was also in a place to be able to send love and connection and care back to your present moment self, still enduring the difficulty of your incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, that framing of things was so moving to me, and I wonder if you could speak to that.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't want to give anything in the book away, but I think it's important. And I think, yeah, I think it's important to address. So I know nothing about quantum mechanics and like the way that the quantum field, all that stuff is, it's beyond, way above my pay grade. But one of the things that I started to explore in my own spirituality was that things aren't linear, right? Like if I'm like having these conversations with my younger self, and these aren't like, again, they're not hallucinations, they're not
Mm-hmm.
astral projections. They're not anything that we call woo woo, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
woo woo. There's something really happening in my body.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can have these conversations with my younger self and begin to release energy and trauma from that, like why can't I then have conversations with my future self, right? Like why is that not a thing? Um, because if spirituality isn't linear, then if I'm still in that sort of spiritual meditative realm, like why
Mm-hmm.
not? And so
Right.
what I began to do is I began to ask my future self for help and for
Mm,
prayers and for help and energy and love and get me through this thing that is really scary and really like isolating and lonely and shitty.
mm,
And so I think that's probably the extent of what I want to share because I don't want to give too much away. But there was a reality in real time in my meditation when I just had this sort of shift of like, oh yeah, like all the versions of myself are here to help me, uh, whether it's past, present, or future, or young or old, or they're all here for me, to help me. And so why not lean on them? Just as my younger self is now able to lean on myself in prison,
mm,
then maybe my prison self is able to lean on like the future parts of myself that haven't haven't happened yet. So,
mm.
and,
Yeah,
and to sort of go full circle, I now out of prison send energy and love back to myself in prison. Um,
yeah.
and so I think that's maybe what you're getting at, but it's full circle, right? Because like there were points in prison where I didn't know I was going to get out alive, yet alone know that I would be the one sending energy back to me. And so, and I think there's a lot of spiritual questions that come up, right? So when people say they pray to God and there are answers, like I guess we don't necessarily know like what that looks like, but why not entertain the idea that who we're praying to is just we're just asking for help from a future version of ourselves that has the capacity to help the younger parts of ourselves. I don't know.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
if that's too crazy, great, let it go. It's kind of crazy. But like yeah, take it if you want it and leave it if you don't, whatever.
Yeah, yeah. No, but it's part of the like I said earlier, the when I was reading it's like, you broke the mold, you explored meditation and your own psyche and personality and spirituality on your own terms,
Mm.
and with a certain kind of a flexibility and creativity to your thinking
Yeah.
that didn't follow rules. And so I'm hearing that coming through clearly,
Mm.
even in how you're framing this.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, I think, what if we touch on what you're up to now?
Mm.
You've written this book. You luckily you did survive and in some
Right.
ways thrived, via this experience, and then you came out and you started Northwest Wisdom,
Mhm.
and you're on a mission of various kinds. I wonder if you could speak about kind of where you're heading.
Yeah, I mean, first off, thank you so much for just taking the time to talk. And yeah, I mean, I think one thing the that prison does to people, just like any kind of falling or death, right, does to people, is it kind of gives them a little more space to realize I don't know, and that's okay, right? So there's just more space to say I don't really know, but I know that I'm going to be okay, which then like it frees up the energy and it frees up the space inside you for things to work often. Like when you're too tight against something, that's when things don't happen the way you want it. But if you're just like, hey, so one of the things I knew in getting out of prison was I wanted to help people, and I didn't really know how. But for
Mhm.
the first year, I said, I need to like decompress. I mean, I've spent 3 years surrounded around some of the worst people alive, honestly. And
Mhm.
I need to just take some time to heal. And so the first thing I did was I found a therapist who was very um, welcoming of who I was, and his I'm still seeing her. So, I that hasn't gone away, and I hope it doesn't go away for some time. But that's the first thing I did was I didn't get right to it. I decided
Mhm.
I need to sit in the isness and
Mhm.
the stillness and the unknown,
Mhm.
and do some work on myself, which I continue to do. But as I did that through my first year, it came clear that okay, I've got now something that I can help people with, which seems to be a trend in spiritual like context. The idea is that your wound then becomes like your way forward, right? Your
The
wound,
wounded healer. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Like, and so
Yeah.
I can take the thing that has been painful and hurtful to me, and then help other people. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be in the prison system, but just primarily anyone who's dealt with trauma in some ways, and providing new ways for people to walk through things if they want to.
Mm.
And so I sat with it for a long time, and then decided, I think, just kind of like with my book, I just knew it was time. Like it just felt right in my body to then explore routes for creating a safe place for people. And so we were able to very quite easily create Northwest Wisdom as a nonprofit. And at least in my experience, when something feels right, it kind of just like naturally happens. Like
Mhm.
there isn't a force, there isn't a push against it. It just kind of happens. And so this kind of just happened, which felt like a good sign. Um, and so Northwest Wisdom currently, as it stands, um, is online. Like we don't have a physical building yet, um,
Mhm.
but right now I still have clients that I meet with, and I provide spiritual coaching or spiritual counseling, and my wife, she provides yoga one-on-one
Mhm.
instruction, and I also provide Reiki, like for people who need it. So like our goal is to create a safe space, honestly, for people to find healing in ways that they need, and hopefully over time I just kind of gather more tools from my tool belt, whether that's a somatic certification in somatic therapy or whatever it is.
Mhm.
Just providing a safe space and an avenue for people to sit with their trauma or their hurt, primarily spiritually, and racially, um,
Mhm.
in new ways. And so that's
Yeah.
what we're doing now, is just starting to build the framework for what that looks like. And we're kind of open to seeing where it goes. We both don't know what that looks like exactly, but we trust that it's going in the right direction. And then again, the last 6 months, I just knew it was time to start writing a book, so I took some time off and just did it. And I worked hard at it, and I spent hours and hours and hours, and then I spent hours and hours and hours submitting to literary agents and publishers, and now that is really coming to fruition, and I'm getting a lot of good responses from different publishers. And so the next step is just to kind of let that play out the way it's going to play out and get published, and hopefully the publisher asked me this, and my wife asked me this too. Is she said, "What's your goal? Like, what's your goal? And is it, is it to become famous? Is it to whatever?" No, my goal is to help people heal. That's like kind of all I want is to help people heal who feel like they don't know where to go and they don't know how to heal. And so I imagine it'll open up in ways that are unseen now, but we're kind of approaching it with open palms. So.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, my real pleasure and honor to have this conversation and to see an early copy of your book, and it's definitely been very, as I've said several times, I need a new word, but it's been moving for me, and exciting. The other thing I'll say about your book is that in addition to being moving, because it's a moving story, and it's also really it's rich, and I find myself, having gotten to the end of it, the feeling I have is like, okay, well, this was like an awesome capture. And like, I'm interested in seeing the book in about 10 years, maybe 5 years, 10 years. Like I'm sort of seeing like, I'm curious what a future project will be. And I know you don't know that yet, but the reason that comes up in my mind is that, what I suspect is that, that there's more, you have a gift for framing and writing, these experiences that you've had. And the hunch that I have is that there's more of that teacher in you, educator, teacher, wordsmith. So in any case, that's what I'm anticipating. Whether I'm right or wrong, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That's really sweet of you. I guess I'll say this kind of before we wrap up, because I think it's important, is that I'm an intern for P2P, which is a nonprofit that helps people who have dealt with incarceration get into college. And so I'm still in that realm. And I also just wanted to say, in regard to my book, like people in prison and getting out of prison, it's a real thing, right? And so really just kind of making sure that listeners hear that from a person who deals with that, is like, people getting out of prison, like, landlords won't rent to them, people won't rent to them, people won't give them jobs, and they're people. And so I think a part of the hope of the book is to at least open up a space for dialogue for people who aren't aware of that like marginalized people, whether you're marginalized because you're poor or you have a different skin color or orientation, or you're incarcerated, like, we're all people in need of help from each other, and we can be outlets and avenues of help, as opposed to, again, that binary system of pushing up against each other. But that was part of the intention of the book. It wasn't the whole intention, but part of the intention was just to paint what we normally see as like a bad thing or taboo or whatever, and say, oh no, there's real people and real stories behind all this stuff. So I think it's important to kind of to say that too as well.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you included that.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, why don't we wrap here, and maybe there'll be a future conversation.
We'll see. Thanks so much, Alex.
Thank you, bro.
Yeah. All right. You take care.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Redbeard Embodiment Podcast. To learn more, visit us at redbeardsomatictherapy.com or send me an email at alex@redbeardsomatictherapy.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, help spread the word by subscribing and sharing with others. Hope to see you next time.